Well, welcome everyone who's tuning in. We're back for the first time in, I guess, going on 3 years with the Charter Public Science Symposium. And last couple of years, of course, we've been pretty much stressed with COVID and weren't able to do the roundtable. Hopefully everything is going to get back on track now. This evening, of course, we have the major portion of the symposium, and again, of course, it will be live, so that's refreshing. The round table, although we don't really have a round table, we have sort of an arc of chairs. The round table has been going on now for, I think 12 years, decided to do this, and it's just sort of an informal discussion on sort of the topic of the symposium, but it's generally far-ranging, and we get off on tangents, as I'm sure we will, because of the topic that we have today, which is stress. And of course, it's a fascinating topic. It defies definition. So we'll see what we can come up with. We have invited a number of guests to get involved in this discussion. So I think the best thing to do is we'll just go around a little bit so that you just say a few words about yourself, what your interest is, where you are doing. And we'll start with Debbie Schwartz, who spells her name the same way as I do, which is
what a coincidence.
Not a coincidence. Okay, Debbie.
So my name is Debbie Schwartz, and I'm a family doctor. I have a family practice, and I also work in the emergency room. So I definitely had my fair share of stress, saw my fair share of stress, and continue to. I've got 3 little boys at home, which is probably more stressful than work as well.
John.
I'm Dr. John Denninger. I'm Director of Research and Clinical Training at the Benson-Henry Institute for Mind-Body Medicine at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, also at Harvard Medical School. I'm a psychiatrist. I'm also a trained biochemist, PhD biochemist, although I'm not doing a lot of basic science these days. And what we do at the Benson-Henry Institute is study stress, essentially, and study how mind-body practices like meditation, yoga, and the like can impact the biology of stress. It's a good place to start.
Melissa.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm Dr. Melissa Lem. I'm a Vancouver family physician. I work on the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations, otherwise known as Vancouver. And I also do rural practice other than my city practice, where I do some emergency medicine as well. And I'm Director of Park Prescriptions for the BC Parks Foundation, which is Canada's national nature prescription initiative. I'm also President-elect of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment and a clinical assistant professor at the University of British Columbia in the Department of Family Practice. So really enjoy communicating with the public, with medical learners, and talking about all kinds of different things. I see a lot of patients in my practice that have high levels of stress, especially over the last few years. So it's great to be here and chat with everyone today.
I'm Eric Galbraith. I'm a professor here at McGill University, and I'm the Canada Research Chair of Human Earth System Dynamics. So I'm not particularly focused on stress, but I'm really trying to develop new perspectives on how global humanity can live in a better balance with the rest of the Earth system. And I really am very interested in trying to do that in a way that maximizes subjective well-being. And so I've actually worked quite a bit with Chris, who you'll hear from next, trying to get to the roots of what it is that makes people feel satisfied with their lives. And of course, stress is a part of that. So that's it.
Chris.
Yeah, my name is Chris Barrington-Leigh, and I'm also a prof here at McGill. And as Eric just said, one of the things I work on is understanding what it is that makes for happy individuals and happy communities and happy societies. And the approach, that's an interdisciplinary field and question, of course. I'm an economist. A lot of the work on big data, getting at that question, has been done by economists. And we have data from a lot of data nowadays from around the world, and thanks to the pandemic, maybe some higher frequency data on these overall evaluations of life, as well as some other kinds of subjective well-being. So definitely I'm not an expert in any way on stress, but that's related to these other measures of subjective well-being, which are asked, I guess, more often.
Unfortunately, Rob Whitley, who was supposed to be with us, also a professor here, has come down apparently with food poisoning. Hopefully not from one of McGill's cafeterias. I put together some points that I think would be interesting springboards for discussion, but we'll see where it goes. But I think first we have to get our heads around just what stress is. I think we all have an idea. I mean, you kind of know when you're stressed and when you're not. But scientifically, definitions of stress are very, very hard to come by. So I thought it would be interesting to start with that and ask everyone, what does stress mean to you? Maybe we'll start with Chris at the end.
This is very much I'll start with very much the layperson's response. When you say stress, I immediately think of a dichotomy between good stress and bad stress from my own introspection, I guess, in my life. Other than the self-reflection of thinking when I'm in at a moment in time, I guess something that comes up that relates to my work is that part of explaining to people why something like life satisfaction, someone's answer to an overall life evaluation, may be a good or interesting window into life overall, is to differentiate that from measures of bliss or affective measures by pointing out that somebody who's satisfied with their life is not relaxed and blissful all the time. In fact, people who are satisfied with their lives have challenges and I would say undergo stress, but probably they are that stress is part of overcoming challenges with other people that help other people. If they're very happy, if they're very satisfied with their life, they are probably that's the context in which they're experiencing stress.
So I've been stressing about this question for the last week, actually. But I would say, for me, anticipation of future outcomes is a really important part of stress. I feel like if you anticipate possible outcomes that are negative and which you might potentially be able to influence through some kind of action, for me, that feels like the core of what a stressful thing is. For example, if you anticipate that you're going to be sitting on a stage and forced to answer a question about what stress is at some point in time, and you should be preparing your answer for that moment, that can be a stressful thing. But I feel like it's inherent that there's some kind of uncertainty in your ability to do it, that maybe you're not going to have enough time, that you don't have the right tools, that you can't possibly come up with the right things in order to make this a success and avoid the undesirable outcome. But for me, it's all about that, anticipating something that you don't want to happen and potentially being able to avoid it, but not being sure if you can.
As a physician, I know I have others following me here, but I'm going to default to the World Health Organization definition of stress, which is a change that occurs that can result in mental, physical, or psychological strain. And then our bodies have a very specific, some bodies have certain responses to stress, but I think how our well-being is determined in some part is how we learn to, or how we choose to, or in some ways what we inherit in terms of our ability to deal with that stress. So we have a lot of choice, I think, over how stress affects us. And that's something that I definitely experience and struggle with most days.
So, yeah, I mean, the question of what stress is, it seems so simple, doesn't it? And yet it's really not so simple. I'm very impressed that you have that WHO definition.
I looked it up. I knew this question was coming.
The definition that I've been using for myself, and I don't even like it, I don't think it's a perfect definition, is how our brains and bodies respond when we're encountering a threat or a challenge. And threat challenge is one of those things that I think you can change that depending on your perspective of things. That's how I tend to think of it. The reason why that definition is not completely satisfying is that there's something about stressors, the things that happen out in the world that affect us, and something about the stress response, how our brains and bodies respond. And I think stress is somewhere in the middle of those two things. It's sort of on the path between what the stressor is and what the stress response is.
Okay, so for me, stress, it comes when I don't have control over something. So, I think most of us are probably type A personalities, at least the medical ones. Imagine. Most of us who go into medicine end up being type A personalities. And so I definitely thrive off of stress, off of stressful situations. That's kind of like my niche in a way. But I'd say that would be the good stress. But then the bad stress is definitely what I don't have control over. So whether it be like in the emergency room, let's say, and a patient is going sour and, there's nothing that I can do to change it, or if I'm not sure what to do in the moment, I find those kinds of situations to be, very stressful in probably a negative way. And then the lack of control. So like stress in the house, let's say with, like I mentioned, I have 3 young kids. The house is very chaotic, which I think that my dad can attest to. Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's very stressful being a mother of 3 young boys, and again, it's like a lack of control. Like sometimes when I feel like I can't wrangle them in, and they're not listening, and each one is going in a different way. That's very stressful to me.
Interesting perspectives. I think to me, stress is being in a situation you don't want to be in. That's the way I would look at it. But I don't know if you guys know, but stress started on this very stage. Hans Selye, who's the father of stress, the word stress, he's the one who introduced stress, was a professor of biochemistry here at McGill. And his seminal paper was written in 1936 in Nature, in which he introduced the whole concept of stress. Before that, it was never discussed. And he gave a number of public lectures here at McGill. One of them was right here. So this is sort of holy ground. This is where it all started.
So we should be feeling very stressed right now.
Yes. All right.
Emanating from the stage.
Now, passing on to a bit more general question. It turns out, at least this is the statistic that I dug up, that happiness in countries is not necessarily related to how well the country is doing in terms of gross national product. And the reason I brought this up because I was surprised to find out that Finland, which on all of the lists ranks highest in terms of people who are satisfied with their life. The Finns are extremely happy. I don't know if it's because they're doing their saunas and jumping into cold water or what, but they're very happy. And the gross national product of Finland is not that great. They're, economically, they're not doing that well. And yet the Finns are very happy. And then you look at some developed countries like, the US, where generally people are not happy. So how would you, what do you think about that in terms of happiness in different countries? Why do you think we see this? I mean, you look at these rankings and there are dramatic differences between how happy people are in countries, and some of what we would think are underdeveloped countries have more happiness than some of the developed countries. Anyone want to tackle that one?
Well, I'm not going to cling to the WHO definition, but an analog here is I will have to represent the data strictly. So, Finland, by the way, is a developed and wealthy country nowadays. So, on the international scale of things, that is a high GDP per capita And if you look across countries, it's, while we are often in my field focusing on the rest of the story, it is still the case that GDP is a strong correlate of life satisfaction across countries, GDP per capita. So the interesting thing is what's missing from the story if you just focus on GDP, if that's all you come to to the table with to understand it. And so what we know from studying life satisfaction at the individual and up to the national level is that a lot of the other things are also very important, and in fact, if you put them together, they're more important than our material consumption levels. And the really short story version of what those things are is that they are all about social relationships. They're all about how we relate to each other and how we see ourselves vis-a-vis others. Whether we feel like we belong to groups and whether we have close relationships, whether we trust our institutions and other people that we are likely to encounter, and so on. So a lot of things to do with us being incredibly social beings seem to be, even if they're not what comes first to mind when you say how good is life, cognitively, if you reflect in the way that people do when you ask them a question, like taking all things into account, how satisfied are you with your life these days on a scale of 0 to 10, which is where the Finns for a few years have been at the top, then when people do that calculation, it tends to reflect the social context of their lives.
It's very interesting you bring up the social context, because there are all kinds of studies and people who are diagnosed with dire medical conditions and get involved in support groups, and that they have better clinical outcomes than ones who don't have support groups. How would you explain that? What do you think is behind that? Why does that work?
Why do support groups work?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a little bit what Chris was talking about, is this ability to connect with other people. I actually do a fair amount of group psychotherapy, and these are with patients who have, serious illnesses. Being in a room with other people, although it's been in a virtual room for the last couple of years, but being in a room with other people and the ability to connect with other people on a basis where the intent of that group is to help each other makes an astounding impact on people's feelings about their lives. And sometimes we're talking people who have very little else in their lives as well.
But just the fact that you see other people who have the same problem, right? Does that make you feel better? That you know?
I think there's something. Would we agree that there is something to the fact that when you don't feel alone, that helps? But I would say even in groups of people whose problems are not identical, who aren't necessarily in a group that is, all around one kind of topic, there's just that ability to make connection with other people who are suffering can be a huge salve for people.
I want to add something.
Yeah.
Sorry, I want to go back to the GDP point. I know, and it's weird for me as a physician to be talking about GDP, but I do a lot of work in the environmental sphere, and we have to think about what's included in GDP, as you know. So, for example, the costs to clean up an oil spill are included in GDP. That's a positive for GDP. When the highway gets flooded and you have to repair it because of floods due to climate change, that is included in GDP. So I think in some ways GDP is a bit divorced from what actually makes us well in some ways. And then also the GDP is a measure of economics. And there's research showing that the average everyday person doesn't care that much about economics. They care more about the health and well-being of themselves and their family over and above some kind of number. Sorry to kind of take the conversation back that way, but I wanted to add those points, is that GDP in some ways is a poor proxy for how we're doing overall as a society and our well-being.
Well, and I could also add that this is something that we were really interested in looking at in my group, because as Chris mentioned, if you take all the data and put it up on a plot, where you look at the GDP versus how people answer that life satisfaction question, you do see that there's this big cloud that correlates with GDP. So people say they're more satisfied in wealthier countries on average, although, of course, there are these discrepancies, like Finland versus the US. And it doesn't get better in time in a country as the GDP increases. So, but we were just curious, like, what is it like in places that don't even use money? Like, what if you just go to places where GDP doesn't exist because the societies are not monetized? And it's very difficult to find these in the world now. There's hardly any left. But my team managed to find some communities in the Solomon Islands in the Western Tropical Pacific where people weren't using money, really, tiny bit, not really. They were just growing their own yams and going out to fish in their dugout canoes. And we were fascinated to find that when we asked them these standardized questions, they answered they were just as satisfied as the people in Finland. So unlike most of the people at the low GDP countries, which are quite low in their satisfaction, Sub-Saharan Africa tends to be very low. In the Solomon Islands, with no money at all, they were very satisfied. They also reported that they spent a lot of time feeling happy. They weren't worried, which was basically our translation of stress. They were not particularly stressed. So showing that whatever it is that makes people satisfied in high GDP countries is not related to the money itself or the economic productivity. Rather, it's what's going on in their lives, their community structures, these other things.
Well, with the stress business, I mean, the mind-body connection, of course, is an integral factor here. And I don't think anyone doubts, there's a connection. I mean, the example, simple example, the phone rings in the middle of the night and your heart starts to race, right? Even though no one has touched you. So obviously it's being generated from the mind. But does that not introduce a certain kind of problem when people say that you can think your way back to health, or that, we know, of course, that the placebo effect is very real. And sometimes that is taken so seriously that people who have various kind of medical conditions think that if they're not getting better, it's because they're not in the right frame of mind. They're not thinking about it properly. Do you think there's something to that? And that they actually burden themselves for not being able to generate the right body connection, mind-body connection to get better?
I just this morning for myself invented the term recursive stress, where you're stressed about being stressed or stressed about your inability to calm down, that sort of thing. I mean, I don't think there's any question that people's fears about themselves can cause damage. And one thing I think we try to avoid a lot in medicine these days is this idea that if something happens that it's your fault, like you weren't positive enough. There was that big positive psychology movement around cancer treatment. I forget exactly when that was, 20 years ago or so, which did a lot of harm because a lot of people who weren't getting well because of their disease was difficult. They felt like they were doing something wrong by not being positive.
This was like the Simonton regimen where you were supposed to visualize the tumor being eaten away in your body.
Right. And so I think it's very important to, this is one of the things we do in mind-body medicine all the time, is sort of hold these two sides of things, right? You can say, okay, I have stress in my life and I experience things, but it's okay. It's okay for that to exist. And on the other hand, we can do things that try and protect ourselves against it, but not stress out about the fact that we may not be doing it perfectly. I don't know if others have thoughts on it.
Yeah, I agree with you, John, about how there are limits to the mind-body connection. Like I've definitely had patients who sometimes subscribe to more alternative therapies and don't pursue traditional cancer treatment, for example, because they think if they drink enough wheatgrass or visualize enough that their tumor will disappear. And there can be a danger to overemphasizing the mind-body connection, but I think it still is really important to do so because we have a lot of different pharmaceuticals that we prescribe for different psychological conditions, but there's evidence showing that cognitive behavioral therapy, different kinds of structured psychotherapy are just as effective as those prescription medications. So I think there's a balance, recognizing that there is definitely a role, but not going too far down the rabbit hole at the same time.
But Debbie, do you think that because of the limited time that you have to spend with patients, like in the family practice, are you limited by not being able to counsel them enough about mind-body things and stress relief, and you just want to get them out of the office?
Yeah, so that's definitely a big challenge. I wish I had more time. I wish that things were different so that I could have more time with each patient. And I think that you always talk about this, but how patients often go and seek alternative care because their primary care physicians don't have the same amount of time. So when you go see, a a naturopath or a chiropractor even, or an osteopath, they definitely have a lot more time, right? They end up spending at least an hour with you, which is kind of really difficult in family practice, especially here in Quebec. So I think that that's a really big challenge. You try to kind of pack a punch within those 15 minutes. I hate to be a pill pusher, so I always try to focus more on the counseling aspect. I'm definitely not somebody who runs to prescribing, because it definitely comes with its negative side effects. So there's definitely a balance there. But yeah, it's really, really challenging. One thing that I try to take the opportunity to always remind patients is the value of exercise, how important that is. And I think I'm kind of killing two birds with one stone there, because obviously it's important for cardiovascular health, but in my mind it's so important for mental health. So I feel, at least I try to kind of take little shortcuts here and there.
And there's good biology behind that exercise thing, and that SSRIs and even electroconvulsive therapy increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and that's exactly what exercise does. So for my patients who have depression, I'm often, sometimes it's hard for them to get themselves to do
Motivated,
it, but if you can get them to exercise, it can be a huge benefit in terms of depression as well.
I talk about how it's like a cycle, and sometimes you just have to start that cycle, because once you start it, then once the adrenaline is released, you kind of end up in the positive cycle as opposed to the negative cycle.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, to focus in a bit more on that, what about things like Tai Chi and yoga specifically, as opposed to cardiovascular exercise?
Yeah, I mean, the benefit of practices like Tai Chi and yoga, I think, extend beyond just the exercise component. And a lot of the sort of, what I think of as the most sort of restorative yoga and Tai Chi tends to be not incredibly aerobic. Mm-hmm. It is instead practices that I think of as more mind-body type practices, which have a very strong meditative component. And I think that's what separates them. You can, actually, our founder, Herb Benson, long time ago, did a small study, was never published, where he had people instrumented on treadmills running at constant speed, and he taught them to meditate, and he had them first run just as they normally would run, and he had them meditate while they were running, with their eyes open, obviously, on the treadmill. And in about half of the patients, there was actually a decrease in oxygen consumption during meditation, which has led us sometimes, if someone says to me, I'm a runner, I'm not going to be able to take the time to meditate. I say, well, you can do it while you're running. It's
interesting you bring this up,
exercise.
because I've had a long-standing interest in the whole body-mind connection, all of this, and meditation, and I've tried, and I can't, and I don't know what I'm doing wrong, and then it stresses me that I can't meditate. So how do you meditate? What do you do?
Well, interestingly, I mean, I hear that so much. I mean, when I talk to audiences, when I talk to patients, when I talk to colleagues, I often ask the question, have you ever tried to meditate? And then my next question is, have you decided you stink at it? Because that happens all the time. I think the most important thing to realize about meditation and other similar practices is that it's not about some, perfect state that you're trying to get to. It's about practice. That's why we call it practice, we sometimes say. And so the thing to be doing is to do the practice and not have big expectations for the results.
Well, how do you know when you're there?
It's a little bit like being in love, right? You know it when you get there. No, but I joke, and yet it's a little bit like that, because it's not about. There's no way that you can blank the mind. You can't make the mind empty. We're human. Our brains come up with things all the time. That's what we do. What you can do is you can sit and notice that that's happening, and then notice, that thought, made me a little nervous, and then you can just let that be there, let that exist. And then it fades, and then something else happens. And you just do that over and over again. In my talk tonight, I have a great slide that
have you guys tried?
about this.
But
meditating?
the running part, though, that's the, like, you know, I've meditated before.
Yeah,
I can
yeah.
sort of reach that state. But how do you, when there's so much physical input coming in, how do you meditate when you run?
Yeah, it's different, but it's a little bit like a walking meditation in that you can do a meditation when you're walking where the focus is your footfalls or the breath or something like that. I would posit that it might not be quite as effective as a seated meditation, but it is possible to change the state of your brain while you're running if you do that. Different from, like, you know, blasting music in headphones where you're trying to distract yourself from discomfort or that sort of thing.
Well, I think it's like a zone out. Do you, like, I've done that before when you're running, that you just sort of zone out and.
The thing, I mean, it would be kind of like, in some ways it's a zone out, but it's sort of like a zone in that you're not trying to go away from whatever's happening in your body, but you're trying to pay close attention to it.
And do you know when you're in that state?
Yeah, I think you often do. I think what happens all the time is that you notice when you've left that state,
Okay.
right? And then you get yourself to refocus. I don't want to do it.
Can we bring in I mean, I've got various comments stacked up maybe
Yeah.
into different things, but
Please.
to what we're talking about now, I'm interested in how this relates to flow, which is sort of meditative, but it's not somebody trying to meditate while they're running. It's somebody who's maybe running a little faster than they would be able to say, oh, I'm going to now do some practice. But it maybe has a lot in common.
It seems reasonable to me.
And I wonder, you know, how that relates to stress. I also wonder what is the exact opposite of stress, and if
My dog.
your dog.
Well, I mean, that's interesting. I always thought it was intriguing that flow, which is this state where you lose track of yourself as an individual, is described as being one of the most pleasurable things possible. So it's actually the hyper-awareness of ourselves as individuals that causes all these problems, and that actually we feel best when we can forget about ourselves as individuals.
What about faith in terms of religion? Do you think that people who have deep faith and believe that if they live their life well, there's an afterlife that they look forward to, are they less stressed with daily events?
Well, I can speak to life satisfaction, not just
that's good.
more than stress.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a question that we've been asking, many people have been asking for a long time about one of the many determinants of what makes for a satisfying life. And again, as I said, was a good summary for a lot of the literature. The answer usually comes down to a social one, in that people who are religious are happier than those who aren't, after you control for everything else that you have. But mostly that seems to come through their practice with others. Maybe a little bit of solo practice as well, but if you try and separate out the belief part, it doesn't play into our equations.
Well, then we brought up the dog, which I mean, there's serious research on that, on pet therapy, and I mean, they're bringing pets into hospitals now. I mean,
Well, I thought you were talking about the dog not being stressed.
He's not. No, him too. He's not too. It's a very
It's
stress-free
infectious.
kind of life, right? You sleep. He sleeps most of the day. He's an old guy. He gets fed regularly, so there's no fear over, not getting fed. And he gets walked regularly. So there's not
That's
much.
when you're around. Don't people make videos now where they put the camera on their dog when they leave home and the animals are
Well,
stressed out?
I suppose it depends on the dog, but my dad can attest to my dog being probably the best.
yeah, I must say, he's a very good dog.
No, but you're right. You bring up the idea of pet therapy, and how when you might come home at the end of the day. I don't know if anybody else here has any dogs, but if you come home at the end of the day, the dog really does help. Just the act of petting a dog or a cat, whatever it is definitely helpful in stress relief.
I think on the topic of spirituality, just to get back to that, I think a lot of our stress sometimes comes from, especially with type A people, the fact that we want to be in control of everything. You know, like if we can't decide every little part of our schedule and how everything works, we feel stressed. But I think there is a certain amount of comfort that you can get through spirituality where you realize, and this is true even of people who aren't spiritual, that not everything is in your control, that sometimes things happen that you can't control. And I think there is some comfort to be found in that. And also with the thought that another power or a higher power might be looking out for you or your family or the planet or whatever matters to you.
I came across this little statistic, and I thought it was interesting, and to get your opinions on this, where studies showed a 7-fold increase in heart attacks in police officers during exertion training, because they train a lot, of course, and a 21-fold increase, that is a much greater risk of heart attacks when they were subduing a subject. How would you interpret that? I mean,
I have some thoughts on that. I have some thoughts on that. So I think the real difference there, it's kind of like the difference between the physiology of exercise and the physiology of stress, right? Stress, I was talking about threat before. Like if you're in a clearly not friendly encounter with someone you're trying to subdue, the threat is there, and your body gets ready for threat, preparing in the ways that we used to in the old days, right? And as human beings and our fellow creatures were evolving, that what was going to happen in a situation like that was you were going to be wounded, right? You were, if you were being attacked by something, you might be, get a claw, making a gash in your side or something like that. And so what your physiology does there is prepare you not just for, going for a friendly run, but preparing you to get wounded and bleed, etc. And so that's why one of the reasons why the stress response makes people more coagulable. Blood coagulates more easily, and obviously there are other things that happen cardiovascularly that might predispose to heart attacks, for example. I don't know, does that make sense to the other physicians in the room?
I actually had an interesting case once in the emergency room of a patient who got woken up in the middle of the night because there was a robber in his house. And he had sudden onset of chest pain, so obviously called 911, came in. And, of course, when I first saw the patient, I thought, oh, well, this is going to be, a stress-related type of chest pain. And sure enough, his troponin was sky high, and he actually suffered from an actual heart attack from just this, burglar waking him up suddenly in the middle of the night.
And I think there's evidence around people having a higher burden of heart attacks than you would expect in the wee hours. And part of it is because of that cortisol.
Yes, that's right.
Peak that happens at that time, even though they're dreaming, assuming they're not having nightmares or something. But that ramp up in cortisol that happens when someone's stressed out, they're subduing someone, or they think a burglar is coming, also can increase the risk of heart attacks. You're saying.
it was interesting you bring up cortisol. There was a paper that came out assaying cortisol in hair, because apparently it stays there, and you can determine how stressed people have been. And now, of course, they want their cortisol tested, because people want to know, what their overall stress level is. Like you might want your A1C tested for diabetes. Now, is it possible that this introduces more stress because they're so worried about being stressed that they want to have their hair tested?
I think people will worry about, people will worry about things, no matter what. I mean, there are people who are going to worry about health stuff, and there are people who are not going to care about health stuff. And I don't know if this specific thing is a problem, but it is a very interesting measure, because like hemoglobin A1C, it allows you to integrate sort of this level of cortisol. Cortisol is notoriously difficult to use as a measure when you're using either saliva samples or blood samples. But this hair cortisol measure allows you to smooth out all that stuff and get some kind of data. I don't know if there's enough data to show that it actually correlates entirely with sort of stress level. Right. Does anyone else know?
No. You know what I think is important though is if you're in a position where you can do something about that stress, if getting that hair sample, measuring your cortisol levels will say, okay, now I need to make some changes in my life to reduce my stress because it's bad for me, then maybe it would be useful. But if you're a person who actually can't really change anything in your life, and you get that hair sample and you realize you're stressed out, there's no point. So in medicine, we often try not to order tests that we can't do anything about. It's like, okay, that information's interesting, but there's nothing actionable about it. So I think, more information is not necessarily a good thing, always.
No, and in fact, I mean, this is what we're seeing from all the stuff that is being spread around in social media, is that it alerts people to potential dangers that may not be real, like toxins, in everything that you touch. I mean, right now it's all about the perfluoroalkyl substances, the PFASs, which indeed are found all over. But there's so much talk about all of this that people are getting stressed about, touching their shower curtain because it might have some toxic chemical that comes, on their hands. So there's this information overload that I think caters to people being more stressed because they start worrying about things that they before never even knew existed, right? The idea of rest, for example, in Orthodox Judaism, the Sabbath, you don't do anything, you don't drive, you don't turn on the TV, you don't listen to radio, you don't talk on telephone, sort of a total mental rest. Do you think this has merit? Melissa's shaking her head.
Yes. So do you know what's interesting? Is that I actually have never bought a cell phone in my life. So I won my first cell phone.
You steal them?
No, exactly. You'll hear what I do. So in 2008, I won my first cell phone in some contest and bought a pay-as-you-go plan because I actually didn't want to be a prisoner to my cell phone. And then as my life and work obligations have increased over the past few years, I still was using my 12-year-old, pay-as-you-go phone. And then actually the CEO of the BC Parks Foundation started getting annoyed that he couldn't get a hold of me all the time. So he gave me a cell phone with a fully loaded data plan. This was half a year ago. Anyway, and so obviously I'm a proponent of being unplugged as much as you can because, not even kind of wanting a cell phone myself. But I think it is important because when our brains are constantly distracted by things, when you constantly have this pull to check your email or check your text or whatever, you're not fully in the moment and you can't be mindful. So I think it is really important to turn devices off, get outside if you can into nature. That's what I'm going to be talking about later because it is important for our brains to have a break.
There was a study that looked at what happened when people had their phones like next to them face up, like in a drawer and then in the other room, and there was increasing attention the further the phone got away. I mean, even having it in a drawer near you, it's like it's close enough that you could look at it and people wanted to look at it. Even if they didn't, they were thinking about, I wonder what my phone is.
Attention and IQ on tests, right? I mean,
I didn't know.
If it's next to you, you're still losing 5 IQ points. If it's out of the room, it's a bit better. If it's on the desk, upside down, 10, this kind of thing.
Yeah, it's excellent. Terrible.
Yeah, because our brains only have so much capacity for attention, right? If you're using 5% of it on thinking, what's my cell phone doing, you're not able to use your full potential, right?
I just bought my first ever new cell phone this past year, and I spent most of the month of August in living a very simple life, not fully unplugged, but in the mountains, and I had a very strange stress or anxiety, I don't know. No, when I came home, I couldn't believe that I owned an apartment and that there was all this stuff I hardly recognized. And so I don't know how that relates to the definitions of stress I've heard, but it's really nice to have a simple life and be able to sort of keep in your head everything that you need without all of the many dimensions that we have to manage in the modern world.
Well, and maybe I can one of the things that really struck me in this work with the Solomon Islanders, these non-monetized people in the tropical Pacific, that I didn't expect was that there was no planning for the future at all. There was no planning about what they were going to have for dinner the next day, let alone the same day. They were just kind of hanging out, and when they got hungry, they'd go find some food. And if they felt like having a fish, they'd get in the boat and they'd paddle out and see if they could catch a fish. And that was kind of it. If there was something that needed to be fixed on the house, they just fixed it. But it was all just very much in the moment. And not because they were trying to practice mindfulness, but I think probably more likely that's just the way that humans were for many, many thousands of years. until we constructed this very complex society in which we have all these things tugging at our attention, when we have all these ways to plan things far into the future, and when we have all these expectations for things that are coming up down the road that we need to plan for. So on the one hand, it's like, it's the tools that allow us to build these very complex societies and do all these wondrous things, but at the same time, it really takes a toll by just loading too much onto our limited attention spans, and as we try to get pulled in all these different directions at the same time.
It's a balance, right? I mean, I think the planning, surely part of what defines us as a species. It's not just the modern civilization.
Of course, sure, right. I agree.
But it has sort of enabled modern civilization in many ways, right? That ability to plan, and also brought us a lot of grief. I often think about how that ability to remember what's happened in the past in great detail and to plan for the future is one of the things that causes suffering, one could say.
Well, I must say, when I try to kind of tune out and leave the cell phone, look at it, then I get stressed thinking about how much there's going to be once I look at it again. And that all these emails are going to have piled up, so I've not gained anything.
Oh, I solved that. If I can boast about this, when I left for the mountains, my vacation message didn't just say, "I'll get back to you in a month." I'm exaggerating a little bit here. It actually said, "Email me again in a month because your email is going to disappear." And
Does that work?
Oh, it worked wonderfully. Yeah, I mean, yes. Both in terms of the supply, of incoming messages, which did trail off, and also I felt no obligation when I went. I was actually reading email intermittently, but I felt no obligation. The ones that I wanted to address quickly.
You warned them, right? You warned them that this message is going in nowhere.
Yeah.
There were all those studies, and they talk about yogis in India being able to control their blood pressure and heart rate just by thinking about it. I always used to be suspicious of that. But I've kind of undertaken a study of N=1, where I've started to monitor my blood pressure. Debbie will tell you obsessively, so you know that it should be raising my blood pressure. But I think I can now control it.
How? Can you explain?
I can't explain it. I can't explain it.
That's exactly how Herb Benson got started studying meditation. He was studying a monkey model of hypertension where he used operant conditioning, like Skinnerian operant conditioning, to reward monkeys for changing their blood pressure, sort of elevating or lowering their blood pressure, which worked. And that's when the transcendental meditation people came to him and said, "Hey, you're studying monkeys, but you should study us because we can control our blood pressure with meditation."
Maybe I can do what the monkey did.
Yeah, exactly.
The thing is that you're only controlling it in that moment. That's the concern, right? Like if I can appreciate how one could control it, because don't you find when patients come into the office, if they're like, "Oh, I was just stuck in traffic," or "I was just running," and like their blood pressure is sky high, and then you always do like a BP true where you measure it a couple times and then it gradually comes down. But my concern about that is like, what is it at baseline then? Even if we do get it down, that it's still elevated when you're obsessively checking your emails.
Yes, but when I'm obsessively checking the blood pressure every hour, I have a very good baseline. I know what it is.
I tell my patients to check once a week, because more than that, I find you end up going crazy and becoming obsessed with it.
But I tell you what else I find, is that if you check it in 5 minutes after you've checked it for the first time, which is, you shouldn't check it shorter time than that, it is always lower 5 minutes later.
Yeah. Yeah. Honestly, I feel like sometimes I'm like not even rushing to check my patient's blood pressure in the office, because I feel like it's always misrepresentation of what it actually is.
I know, but then how do you ever know when it's real?
Yeah, I mean, so I really do. I think that there's a lot of evidence behind this BP True machine, where you basically, so you put the patient sits in a room quietly by themselves, and I tell them to, relax, imagine they're on vacation or whatnot, and it actually takes your blood pressure 5 times, and it's a better representation of a 24-hour period.
I think when they did those studies looking at blood pressure targets, they were controlled circumstances. So the protocol was have the patient sit. We're really talking about a lot of blood pressure stuff. Anyway, anyone have hypertension? This is useful for you.
You will now.
So they sat them for 5 minutes, feet flat on the floor, arms supported at heart level, resting for 5 minutes, no talking, no device use. They didn't have devices, I guess, like back when this was done. But so it was standardized to that kind of setting. And so in that setting, if your blood pressure was under 140/90, that reflected better overall, health outcomes. So, but now we have ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, kind of like what you do, where it checks your blood pressure every hour, repetitively. But I think you're right in that often if you wait for 5 minutes, it drops. But that may just reflect that kind of 5-minute waiting period that they used in the research to determine our blood pressure targets.
But I can also make it not drop. So anyway, I'm fascinated by this possibility of really controlling it with your mind. Yeah. Okay. What do you yourselves do to lower stress? If anything.
I exercise. For me, that's a big stress relief. But for me, it's more like a cardiovascular exercise. I find that to be very, very helpful.
I meditate. When I came to the Benson-Henry Institute, I was sort of attracted by the science they were doing. I was not a meditator. I'd had a little bit of exposure to Tai Chi long ago, but over the years, I've kind of fallen in love with the practice, and so I meditate on a regular basis. The other thing I like to do is I like to get out in nature, and I like to go on my kayak and fish, that sort of thing.
Melissa, I think you know what you're going to say.
Yeah, so spend time outdoors. It's something I've been doing my entire life, even before I knew what the research-based benefits were. I spent time in gardens, in parks, biking along the ravines when I used to live in Toronto, de-stressing and essentially self-medicating. But something I do now that I'm a mom, I have a 7-year-old, he's 8 in November, is hugs, like, of my child. It's just, there's nothing like a warm, cuddly kid melting into you and knowing that they think you're the best thing in the world. There's oxytocin release that happens, right, when you have that personal contact. So hugging my child in nature is probably the most de-stressing thing that I can do.
So I also go for 7-year-old hugs. That's a strategy. Similar things. I really find it important to disconnect. I have no notifications of any kind on any devices. I don't look at any screens between 6 p.m. and 7 a.m. Just try to have downtime and quiet, and that works very well.
Yeah, sounds like we have a lot in common on the panel here. My immediate answer, I guess, is that it's the wilderness, getting outdoors, and living a simple life, but also combined with exercise. So I climb mountains a fair bit, and that can be. I'm trying to figure out where that fits into the stress. It can be very intense, and it's physically stressful, but it's a little bit like the flow. I mean, there's just nothing else going on in the world when you're on a climb, even if the exertion is high, and that's really centers me, and it's relaxing in a way.
One of Hans Say's dictums, one of the most famous ones, was that it's not stress that kills you, it's how you handle stress. And, it kind of, makes sense sort of to not sweat the small stuff and knowing what to worry about. And, but in reality, how much of that can you control? What is worth worrying about and what is not worth worrying about? How do you decide that? I think we all appreciate that worrying is not good, right? I mean, it's detrimental to your health. And whenever you're accosted by some situation, yes, it would be great if you could say, well, I don't really have to worry about this, but can you really make yourself not worry about something that you actually are worried about?
I think you can by planning for it. So, if you worry about something, let's say a test, you're going to study for the test. so that you don't have to worry about doing poorly. So I think it comes down a lot to, like for me, it's about control and preparing myself. So worry actually, I actually don't think of it as such a negative, because it helps me to be better, to plan better, and to be better prepared.
One thing that's coming to mind, but we're quite far into this conversation, I still can't articulate the difference between stress and anxiety of various forms, but there's a bigger picture, stress or anxiety, that's increasingly pervasive, and I see it a lot teaching young people. I teach in the School of Environment, and so I'm facing the ones who are particularly focused on at least that part of where our world is headed. And it's pretty overwhelming to think the extent to which nowadays somebody, learning about the world, coming into this world, is faced with uncertainty and lack of control over it. So we're saying, look, here are all these problems, and instead of saying, here's what you have to do, here's the levers you have to push to solve them, we're saying, here are these problems, and they're either insoluble or we don't know how to solve them. In addition, the world's changing so fast that, if we did, it would change in 2 years. And so that's a kind of longer-term stress that young people and everybody is living with. I tend to be able to maintain a very optimistic, is maybe the right word, view of the future, but that's precisely because I have accepted so many things that I don't like, but that I don't think I can change. And so I think it's a matter of focusing on the things over which I may have some agency.
Do you think there's a difference between stress and anxiety?
Well, in terms of physiological definitions, yes, but I'm not sure how it's all. I think of anxiety as there are experts here, but I think of anxiety as being more just about uncertainty about the future.
I feel like stress is more related to action.
Yeah.
Like when you feel like you personally should be taking action on something, but you're not sure what it is or whether you can do it well enough.
That's right.
I mean, the stress response overlaps very well with what happens like during a panic attack. But panic is very different from things like worry, like generalized anxiety disorder, not to put the disorder names on everything. But
What is it, panic attack, sort of a subset of stress?
I mean, it's interesting. It's certainly, it's panic attacks in and of themselves are not an anxiety disorder, but panic disorder can be, and that's where you have panic attacks that come on out of the blue, and you start worrying about them and doing things to avoid having them. Like, you have a panic attack on the subway, and so you decide, I'm never going to ride the subway again, that sort of thing. But I think I wanted to go back to the worry thing. Worry is clearly a kind of anxiety. It can have function, right? It does have important functions for people. It's really about a balance, right? It's about, being able to say, oh, I'm worried about that thing, and not be like, I'm worried about that, I'm worried about it, which is not easy to do if you're inclined to get to that place. And one of the techniques that a psychologist friend of mine told me about is a thing called worry time, which is that you say, okay, I'm going to set aside this 30-minute period every day. That's going to be my worry time. And I'm going to, whenever something arises that I'm inclined to worry about, I'm going to say, I'll worry about that during worry time. And you sort of, consolidate in that.
But what if you don't have time for worry time?
Well, then you make time. That's what you do.
That's exactly what I do with the news. I don't watch any news all week, and then The Economist arrives once a week, and I sit down and I worry for an hour, and then I put it away again for a week.
It's a very
well, it's interesting.
Very effective.
So we were talking about just setting your, social media aside and phones aside. What if the only thing that you set aside is the news? Do you think that has any merit?
So this is not an answer, maybe, but it's now actually thinking even more broadly about the definition of stress, because we've been focused on sort of short-term and individual level, but stress also can apply to systems, and of course it has an engineering meaning. But we live in a world where our social systems, our institutions are stressed, and the natural equilibria are stressed. These are, and so I have just, I thought of that because there's this connection, with eco-anxiety and just this general level of stress that I think is population-wide and in young people with regards to, let's say, the environment. But it's, of course, not just the environment. A lot of our systems are at stress points or stressed like they haven't been, partly pace of change and partly it seems like everything is going wrong. Anyway, so there's these other meanings of stress that go beyond the individual, which, are connected. Reading the news is about all those other things that are stressed, and it makes us stressed as individuals, I guess.
One of the interesting examples that I recall saying was that it's up to you to make the right choice when it comes to stress. And the example that he gave was that you can be walking on the street and meet with a drunk who starts accosting you and yelling insults at you, but is obviously incapable of doing any harm to you, physically. So you have a choice. You can walk past and just ignore that this happened at all, or you can get all angry and trigger some sort of confrontation with them. So his argument was that it's your choice to make. And if you make the right choice and you just walk past, your health is going to be better than if you get into a confrontation. Now, I think, it's an interesting example, but it's also an example where it's easy to make that decision. But in other aspects of life, it's not so easy to know which way you should go. It's like knowing when it is appropriate to worry about something and when it's not. You have a fight with someone, you just say, well, this really wasn't important enough, let's just forget it, and maybe tomorrow, we'll talk about something else. Or you think, well, no, this has to be battled out right now because one of us has to be shown to be right or wrong. Now, I think those kind of life situations are much more difficult than deciding whether or not you're going to walk by a drunk. So, well, it's an interesting philosophy. Is it actually practical? How often in life can you make the right decision?
This also works on different time scales, right? There are aspects of going back again to the society. We can say, well, I'm just going to accept that, or I'm going to take that on, and this is something I can stress about and act on or ignore.
Right.
Where the first is making things better, maybe for more than myself.
But you've got to make the decision, right? You have to make a decision. And this was always his argument, that you're in fact in control of your situation based on the decisions that you make.
I want to point out that, and we were having this conversation at lunch today, that not everyone has that decision that they can make. Like, people have different life histories, they have different responses to stress that they inherited, in utero, for example, or because of traumas that have happened to them when they were younger. So some people, especially women, if a woman came up on someone who was intoxicated on the street, I think they would probably feel more fearful than a man, who came across the same situation. So there are factors definitely beyond our control that dictate how we respond in the moment. But you're right in that we do have a certain amount of choice over how we respond to things. But a lot of it is learned, and a lot of it is a result of what we've experienced before.
Yeah, you brought up an interesting point about the in utero, because there was also this study that I came across that I mentioned here about children of Holocaust survivors having more stress in their life. What do you make of that? Can stress be inherited?
Well, there's some good animal data that Michael Meany did looking at cross-fostering rat pups, but we don't need to get into that now. But this was about epigenetics, right? This was epigenetic transmission of information, and this is the way that I like to think about it. So if evolution shapes organisms over, long periods of time, but if you're an organism and you don't know what the environment that you're going to be born into is going to be like, it would be helpful to have an advance warning of that, right? So if, a mother is in a very, sort of resource-poor environment, say a mother rat in a very resource-poor environment, there may be genes that get turned on that actually where that being turned on gets transmitted epigenetically. Not changing the genes, but changing sort of their state so that some of those genes may get expressed in offspring. And that may be a way for that information to be transmitted across generations, even without evolutionary change at the gene level. So I wonder if that's an example of something like that. Sort of saying, you're going to be, this is a bad world right now. Things are not in good shape. Right. Better get ready to biologically.
And those processes, of course, continue after birth. And
yeah.
There's huge literature on the
people who are just able to shut out bad experiences and move on, others who are not. And we have a very good example. Debbie's grandmother, my mother-in-law, who was a Holocaust survivor, and she never talked about it, never. It was, she was somehow was able to just, compartmentalize it, and she was quite happy, in the rest of her life. On the other hand, I had an aunt who also was a Holocaust survivor, who was in Auschwitz, and there was almost no day that she didn't talk about it, and it totally took over her life. So, how does one shut out, bad experiences?
My inclination is not to shut them out, but rather to, when the mind tries to push things away, they have ways of pushing back, right? So if you try not to think about something, if you push worries away, better to just sort of be present to them rather than trying to rid them from your mind. I don't know, do others?
In your 30 minutes.
What's that?
In your 30 minutes.
Yeah, right, exactly. 30 minutes of worry time.
I think it depends. Like if compartmentalizing something, trying to forget about it works for people, then maybe that's what's going to work for them. I think probably a lot of who you see in your practice, John, and who I see in my office too, for whom that hasn't worked for them, that's when you have to, again, kind of honor it and then deal with the emotions. And that even comes back to when people have eco-anxiety or climate anxiety. A lot of us try to flee from all these negative emotions and try to distract ourselves with social media or whatever, Netflix, YouTube videos, to not think about it. But sometimes these emotions can be positive in that they can spur you to action. There's something called, what's the word for it? But anyway, the acronym is CUE, and it basically speaks to an emotion that spurs you to do constructive, unpleasant emotions. That's the word. And so if you have anxiety or you're afraid of something, you can channel that into taking action. And I think that's what a lot of people in the climate movement, for example, have done, is they honor those emotions, and then those emotions drive them to work on the problem. So we can harness those negative emotions too. They don't all have to be negative, right?
I think that makes a lot of sense, because that's why they've evolved. They evolved the stress as useful mechanisms to activate you so that you can think about more difficult problems and activate yourself to do physically challenging things. I guess it just becomes a problem in these climate anxiety kinds of things because it's not clear what to do, right? You want to activate, but a lot of the time the solution is not clear.
And just, not to repeat myself, but just, I think there's an interesting distinction between the things that are constructive for your own life and dealing with your own improving yourself versus also being spurred to help the collective, because most people who are in the context of climate or eco-anxiety who are taking those actions, those are things which make society progress, not just individuals resolve their problems and overcome their own traumas.
When someone is stressed, they can usually tell you what they're stressed about, right? But
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, but when someone says that they're anxious, they may not be able to tell you exactly what they're anxious about. No, this is why I was, asking the difference between anxiety and stress, right? I mean, sometimes people just have anxiety and they can't explain why. Whereas with stress, I think you feel you're stressed and you can verbalize why you're stressed. Now, what's the difference there?
Well, I'll say we see lots of patients at the Benson-Henry Institute whose doctors send them to us without exactly making explicit why they're sending them to us. And they walk in the room and you can tell from their posture that they're under incredible stress. And they say, I don't know why my doctor sent me here. And so it is not, I don't think either anxiety or stress are always things that are obvious to people, especially the sources. They may know that something's not right, but they may not know the source.
Is stress ever a diagnosis?
I don't think so. There's stress disorder, right?
Yeah, the problem is diagnosis is not, our current nosology of psychiatric diagnosis, for example, is not perfect. There's no question. There are disorders with that in the name, acute stress disorder, for example.
There's a lot of burnout that patients can come seeking help for. And that's always a challenging one to sort of tease out what exactly the issue is. And it's usually stress related. But of course there's anxiety as well. There's anxiety disorders. Potentially people with anxiety disorders might be more prone to having burnout. I think it's important maybe to mention though that like an anxiety disorder, that it really is about a difficulty in functioning.
Yeah.
Right? In functioning in life, whereas stress, people can go around being stressed and are able to actually function. But people with anxiety disorders have a lot of difficulty with functioning and with getting through their day-to-day.
And there is something interesting that can happen biochemically in your brain, even when you're not stressed, that can lead to anxiety disorders. Like I definitely have patients where you ask them any additional sources of stress in your life right now, and they say, no, I have no idea why I feel so jumpy all the time. So I think there can be strange switches that happen in your brain that set off these neurotransmitter cascades that cause anxiety without stress, but you can't really have stress without actual sources of stress, if you know what I'm saying.
Well, I think we've had an interesting discussion here, and I think we've exhausted our time, and if we don't finish on time, I will be stressed. So we will try to alleviate that. Thanks all of you. And just very quickly in 1 minute, Melissa and John, if you want to talk about what you're going to talk about tonight, because some of the people who will be looking in now will not be able to come tonight. So, Melissa?
Should I look at the camera? I can say. So John and I are speaking tonight at the symposium at 7 p.m. and I'm going to be talking about what spending time in nature and connecting to nature can do for your health, and also talk about Canada's National Nature Prescription Program and the progress that we've made in the last 2 years.
And I'm going to be talking about stress. I'm going to be asking the question, is stress good for you? Mostly with the idea of thinking about how we can develop tools for ourselves that can help shift distress into eustress, or good stress.
Okay, thanks. And the talks tonight will be recorded so that you will be able to see them at any time. So thanks all of you. I think it's been a fun discussion.